James, son of Zebedee, better known as James the Greater, was one of the 12 apostles chosen by Jesus to walk at his side. Born on the shores of the Sea of Galilee, amidst the hard work of fishermen and the simplicity of a life dedicated to supporting his family, Tiago never imagined that his story would take on such extraordinary proportions. He was an ordinary man, shaped by the nets and the waves, but when he heard Jesus' call, he left everything behind and became part of something much bigger than himself. Nicknamed by the Master Son of Thunder, Tiago was known for his strength, passion, and courage. He was present at the most intimate moments of Jesus' journey, witnessing miracles that defied the laws of nature and hearing words that transformed the course of humanity. But his life was not without challenges. Like thunder that heralds a storm, James faced persecution and uncertainty, rising from a Galilean fisherman to one of the most influential figures in early Christianity. In this story, we delve into the life of James from his earliest days in Galilee to the last moments of his journey, exploring how he became the first of the apostles to give his life for the gospel. Between difficult choices, profound lessons, and a faith that guided him until the end, Tiago's trajectory invites us to reflect on the true meaning of courage, sacrifice, and service. Your story is powerful, unforgettable, and loaded with meaning. Subscribe to the channel for more exciting biblical stories and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any videos. If you like the content, don't forget to send a thanks a lot. And if you want to support the channel even more, become a member and gain access to exclusive benefits. Tiago was born amid the salty aroma of the Sea of Galilee, in a fishing village where mornings began early and days ended under the golden glow of the sunset reflected in the waters. It was a simple life, marked by the constant sound of the waves crashing against the boats and the voices of families who lived to the rhythm of the nets being launched and collected. His father, Zebedee, was known in the region as a strong and hard-working man, owner of a robust boat and a wisdom that taught more with examples than with words. Salome, his mother, was a woman of faith whose prayers seemed to rise along with the smoke of the lamps at nightfall. Tiago grew up alongside his brother Jonah, the two inseparable like the tides that came and went. At a young age, they learned to work on the family boat, their small hands struggling against the rough ropes of the nets as they watched the older men with the awe typical of childhood. There, in the choppy waters and under the immense sky, he began to know the strength and fragility of life. Each fish caught was a gift, every empty net a lesson in patience. Galilee was a place of mysteries and murmurs. While people talked about politics and the Romans who ruled the land, there were also rumors of something different, something new. Stories about a preacher who walked through villages and did things that no one could explain. Tiago listened to these stories with a mixture of curiosity and disbelief, but continued with his life as a fisherman, believing that destiny was determined between nets and tides. Yet there was something about him, something he himself could not explain, a restlessness like the wind before a storm, something that would soon change everything. The sun began to rise above the horizon, gilding the waters of the Sea of Galilee as James and John cast their nets once again. It was a day like any other, marked by the coming and going of the waves and the incessant work that supported the family. Zebedee, with the experience of someone who knew every curve of that sea, watched his children, giving instructions between one tug and another on the nets. But something different hung in the air that morning. An unusual silence, as if the world was holding its breath. It was then that he appeared, a man with firm steps, but a look that seemed to see beyond the visible. Tiago noticed his presence before he even heard his voice, as if there was an invisible force that was pulling his attention. The man approached and with disarming calm simply said, "Follow me, and I will make you fishers of men." Those words echoed like thunder in Tiago's heart, even though he didn't fully understand what they meant. His brother, Jonah, seemed as surprised as he was, But before anyone could question or hesitate, they both felt something inexplicable, a certainty, an urgency. They left their nets, their boat, their father, everything. There was no argument or elaborate goodbyes, just an impulsive movement that seemed guided by a greater force. The path they followed alongside that man, who introduced himself as Jesus, was marked by a mix of fascination and mystery. With each step, Tiago felt as if he was leaving behind not only the nets and the boat, but his entire life. What exactly did it mean to be a fisher of men? The future seemed like an unknown land, but one thing was certain: there was no going back. As they walked, others joined the group, each with their own story, their own questions. James looked at Jesus, trying to understand who this man was, who, with so few words, had transformed the course of his life. And the answers seemed to be always ahead, like a horizon he couldn't yet reach. The days with Jesus were unlike anything James had ever experienced. The shores of the Sea of Galilee, which were previously the scene of their routine, now became a stage for miracles and crowds. Tiago saw things with his own eyes that defied explanation. A blind man saw, a girl who was dead came back to life, and from little, enough emerged to feed thousands. Jesus didn't just preach. He did things that seemed to bend the rules of the world. It was in this context that Tiago and João gained a nickname that at first sounded almost like a joke, but soon proved to be much deeper. Jesus called them Boanerges, the sons of thunder. Tiago didn't immediately understand why, but over time he began to understand. It was as if that name carried a truth about him that he himself had not yet discovered. His passion, his strength, and even his impetuosity were there, encapsulated in a single word. There was an episode that made this clear. Once, when passing through a village that refused to receive Jesus, James and John, full of fervor, asked the master if they should ask for fire to come down from heaven to consume them, like the ancient prophets. But Jesus' response was a lesson. He firmly rebuked them, reminding them that the kingdom he brought was very different from what they imagined. Tiago felt the weight of those words, like a current of air that precedes a storm, aligning his understanding. However, being called the Son of Thunder wasn't just about strength and momentum. It was also about the courage to face the unknown and the intensity of a faith that was still being shaped. James began to realize that following Jesus was more than abandoning boats and nets. It was allowing every part of yourself to be transformed, and little by little he approached a destiny that was as grand as it was mysterious. As the days went by, James began to notice that Jesus did something that no one else did. He chose those who would walk closer, those who would see what others could not see. Among the 12 apostles, there was a more intimate circle, and James, along with his brother John and Peter, was chosen to be there. It was an invitation that came without explanation, but carried a responsibility that he felt deep in his chest. One afternoon, Jesus took them aside, away from the crowd. The sun was still high when they started climbing a mountain. The silence on the path was broken only by the sound of footsteps and the wind that blew through the trees. When they reached the top, something happened that Tiago would never be able to forget, even if he lived 1,000 lives. Before their eyes, Jesus was transfigured. His face shone like the sun. His clothes became whiter than any fabric James had ever seen. It was as if, for a moment, the sky had opened right there, revealing a glory that human words could not describe. And it wasn't just that. Suddenly, Moses and Elijah appeared next to Jesus, talking to him. James felt his legs tremble, and his mind struggled to understand what he was seeing. Peter, as always, was the first to speak, suggesting building tents for those before them. But before any action could be taken, a luminous cloud enveloped them, and a mighty voice echoed, saying, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. Hear him." James fell to his knees, overcome by a fear that was both frightening and sacred. When everything was over and only Jesus remained there, they began to descend the mountain, with more questions than answers. Tiago felt like he was being led into something much bigger, but what exactly he couldn't yet know. As the silence of the return echoed, the memory of the light and the voice followed him like a shadow. James followed Jesus' steps more and more closely, and the more he learned, the more he realized how much he still had to learn. However, there was something that he and his brother Jonah could not let go of. The idea of a glorious kingdom, a place where they would finally be rewarded for everything they had left behind. It was impossible not to think about it. Jesus spoke of a kingdom to come, but James, like many others, imagined this kingdom as something earthly, full of honor and authority. It was then that his mother, Salome, approached Jesus at an opportune moment. With reverence and courage, she made a bold request that her 2 sons could sit, one on the right and one on the left of Jesus, when he took the throne of his kingdom. James felt his heart quicken as he looked at Jesus, waiting for the answer. But instead of approval, what came was a question that seemed to hide something much bigger. "Can you drink the cup I'm about to drink?" Jesus' voice was calm, but his words weighed like an anchor on James' chest. Without hesitation, he and Jonah answered, yes, they could. But Jesus' look said something different, something that James would only understand with time. "You will drink from my cup, yes," Jesus said, "but to sit at my right or left is not for me to grant. These places belong to those for whom they were prepared by my Father." There was silence. Tiago felt the tension in the air, while the other disciples, upon hearing the request, began to murmur among themselves, indignant. But Jesus, as always, called them close and explained something that would forever change the way James saw greatness. "Whoever wants to be great among you, let him be a servant, and whoever wants to be first, let him be a slave." James listened, but deep down, he felt that he still did not fully understand what Jesus wanted to say. The path ahead seemed increasingly cloudy, and James began to realize that following Jesus meant facing a series of challenges that he could not yet imagine. Each step forward was deeper, like waters that became deeper and more mysterious. Time passed, and the walk alongside Jesus became more and more intense. The crowds that followed him were larger, but also more divided. There were those who believed that he was, in fact, the Messiah, while others, especially religious leaders, began to see him as a threat. Tiago watched everything with attentive eyes, feeling that something big was about to come. It was as if the clouds in the sky were gathering, ready for a storm. He wasn't sure what to expect, but he realized that the days of following Jesus wouldn't be easy. Opposition grew. Once, as they walked towards Jerusalem, Jesus stopped halfway and said something that James would never forget. "Behold, we go up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be handed over to the chief priests and the scribes. They will condemn him to death and hand him over to the Gentiles, and they will mock him, spit on him, flog him, and kill him. But after 3 days he will rise again." The words fell like stones on James. He heard it, but couldn't fully understand it. How could someone who performed miracles, who even had power over the wind and the sea, be defeated? And what did he mean by resurrect? The idea seemed so distant, so incomprehensible, that Tiago preferred to keep it in the back of his mind without questioning it. The tension increased as they approached Jerusalem. The atmosphere among the disciples was heavy. Some, like Peter, seemed determined to protect Jesus at any cost. Others, like Judas, seemed distant, restless. Tiago felt the weight of something inevitable, although he didn't know what it was. As they advanced along the dusty roads, each step seemed more difficult. Jesus' words about serving and sacrificing echoed in his mind. He knew he was on the right path, but the path now was full of shadows and unanswered questions. In the distance, the hills of Jerusalem appeared, and with them, the feeling that a crucial moment was approaching. The night air was heavy, filled with a tension that Tiago could not explain. They were in the Garden of Gethsemane, a place that, until then, had always been peaceful. The surrounding olive trees seemed like old witnesses to many secrets, but that night, even they seemed restless. Jesus had brought James, John, and Peter with him, separating them from the other disciples. The Master's voice, usually calm, now trembled with a tone of urgency. "My soul is deeply sad, even to death. Stay here and watch with me." Tiago felt a knot in his stomach. He had never seen Jesus like that. It was as if something invisible and terrible was pressing down on him, heavier than any net James had ever carried. As Jesus stepped aside to pray, James tried to remain alert, but tiredness overcame him. His eyes insisted on closing, as if his body couldn't support the weight of that moment. When Jesus returned, he found the three of them sleeping. There was pain in his voice, but not anger. "You couldn't watch with me for even an hour?" James felt a wave of shame, but Jesus' words soon became a distant whisper as he returned to prayer. Once again, sleep won. And once again, Jesus returned to find them asleep. But it was the third time that everything changed. The silence in the garden was broken by the sound of footsteps and voices. A crowd approached, armed with swords and rods, led by Judas. Tiago saw the brightness of the torches cutting through the darkness and felt his heart race. Everything happened too quickly. Jesus was betrayed with a kiss, and before James could react, the soldiers surrounded him. Pedro, on impulse, drew his sword and cut off one of the men's ear. But Jesus stopped him, healing the wound, as if he wanted to show that not even in that moment of betrayal would he renounce his mission. Tiago was paralyzed, torn between fighting or fleeing. Tiago's world had turned upside down. The hours after Jesus' arrest were a whirlwind of fear, doubt, and silence. He and the other disciples dispersed, each trying to process what had just happened. It wasn't just the Master who had been taken that night. It seemed that all hope, all the future they had imagined with him, had also been ripped away. James could hardly believe that the man he had seen heal, preach, and even control nature was now in the hands of cruel men. The news of the crucifixion arrived quickly, and James felt as if the ground had disappeared from beneath his feet. He did not have the courage to go to Golgotha, but the echo of the reports of those who were there burned in his mind. The darkened sky, the sound of hammering nails, the scream of pain and abandonment, it was impossible to ignore. He remembered Jesus' words about drinking from the cup. Now he began to understand that the cup was not one of glory, but of sacrifice. But something changed. 3 days later, the news that the tomb was empty spread like wildfire. Tiago didn't know if he could believe it. Was it true? Would it be possible? Then he saw it with his own eyes. Jesus was alive. The Master appeared before them, speaking with the same authority as before, but now with a serenity that James could not explain. Fear began to give way to courage, and to doubt, to certainty. Jesus' kingdom was not of this world, and that was finally starting to make sense. After his ascension, Tiago assumed his role with new determination. There was no more time for hesitation. The mission to carry the Master's message was clear, and he was willing to face anything. But Tiago knew that following this path meant facing greater dangers than he had ever imagined. Opposition was not only inevitable, was imminent. Each step forward was like stepping onto unfamiliar ground, but he was prepared for whatever came, or at least he tried to be. James was now a transformed man, not only because of what he had seen and heard, but because of what he experienced alongside Jesus. The fear that once paralyzed him gave way to a courage that he barely recognized. With the other apostles, he took it upon himself to spread the good news. Jerusalem became the starting point, but the city that had once been the scene of so much suffering was now also the center of relentless persecution. The authorities were determined to silence them. James knew that every time he spoke about Jesus, every time he proclaimed the resurrection, he was risking his life. But how could he remain silent? He had seen the light that transcends the darkness, heard the truth that transforms everything. Nothing could stop that flame that burned in his heart. The days were full of tension. Crowds gathered to listen to the apostles, and each sermon seemed to attract more attention from followers and enemies alike. Tiago did not hide. He spoke with strength, with passion, his voice like thunder that echoed through the streets. Perhaps this was what irritated religious leaders and Romans alike. To them, James was more than a follower. It was a threat. It was then that the order came. Herod Agrippa I, seeking to please the Jewish leaders and consolidate his power, had James arrested. There was no fair trial, just a quick and cruel decision. He would be executed. Tiago knew this moment could come, but still, when the soldiers came, he felt the weight of reality. There was no fear, just a peace he could barely explain. It was as if, even at that moment, he heard the voice of Jesus asking, "Can you drink from the cup that I am about to drink?" And Tiago knew the answer. The following days were marked by an eerie silence. The execution happened quickly, and James became the first of the apostles to shed his blood for the gospel. But for those who loved him and listened to his message, that sacrifice was not the end. Tiago's story echoed louder than ever, defying those who tried to extinguish the light he helped spread. The news of James's death spread quickly among Jesus' followers. For many, it was a devastating blow. As one of the pillars among the apostles, he was a steadfast and passionate voice, someone who did not hesitate to speak with authority, but also from the heart. Now, Tiago was no longer there, and that left a void that was difficult to fill. However, at the same time, his life and death awakened something new, an even greater determination among those who continued his mission. Tiago's reports were not just memories, they were living examples. Each time his story was told, it was as if the thunder of his voice echoed again, inspiring others to be as brave as he was. In Galilee, where he grew up, and in Jerusalem, where he preached, his name became a symbol of unshakable faith. Those who knew him remembered his strength, but also his humanity, his fervor, his impulsiveness, and the way he left everything to follow a higher calling. The years following his death were not easy for the other apostles. The persecution increased, and many wondered if they would be able to endure it. But whenever they weakened, the memory of Tiago revived them. He had been the first to give his life, the first to drink from the cup that Jesus mentioned. Their courage was a reminder that the kingdom they fought for was not of this world, but eternal. Pilgrims and travelers began to talk about James everywhere, his words and actions echoing even in places he had never been. He had become more than a man. It was a symbol of sacrifice and unconditional love. Even the place of his death took on a kind of sacred meaning, as if the ground there held echoes of the strength that James once carried. The story of James, son of Zebedee, is like a powerful wave that does not stop advancing, even long after reaching the shore. His life, marked by bold choices and unshakable faith, left a legacy that spans the centuries. He was not perfect. None of the apostles were. James was impulsive, sometimes even impetuous, as when he asked to bring fire from heaven against those who rejected Jesus. But that was exactly what made him human, close to all of us. He was someone who made mistakes, learned and grew, becoming a powerful instrument in the hands of God. James teaches us that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to move forward despite it. When he left his nets and his family's boat to follow Jesus, he didn't know where it would take him. He did not know that he would witness miracles, that he would face persecution, or that he would be the first of the apostles to give his life. He just knew that there was something in that calling that couldn't be ignored, something that was worth more than anything he had known so far. His story also reminds us that the disciples' path is not made of earthly glory, but of sacrifice and service. James desired places of honor alongside Jesus, but he learned that true power was in serving, even when it meant putting his own life at risk. His death was tragic, but it was not the end. It was the beginning of a message that would resonate even more strongly, inspiring others to follow the same path of faith. James invites us to look beyond our limitations, our fears and our doubts. He challenges us to hear the call, even when we don't fully understand where it will lead. Because in the end, his life is a testimony that true meaning lies not in how much we live, but in how we live, and for whom we live. And that, like the thunder it symbolized, will continue to echo. If you like the story of James, son of Zebedee, and want to continue following other stories of faith and overcoming, be sure to like this video and share it with those you love. And of course, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new content. Together, let's explore more powerful lessons from the Bible.